I love horror games, easily up there in my top 2 genres. However, despite this love, I don't actually get around to playing them too often. Now, this is a contradiction that exists purely because of my own hang-ups. When I play a horror game, I want full and absolute immersion. I need it to be dark and quiet, free from outside interference, so that I can get completely engaged with all the spooks and frights. Obviously, this has a severe downside. It pretty much restrains my playing time to the night, which means often I end up not playing because I get back from work and I have to do other things first, then I'm too tired or just don't have the time. And then even if I do have the time, I'm not in the right mindset. I think I've made my point. So, what does one do if they enjoy a certain type of game, but don't get around to actually engaging with it? Well, you take a stern look at yourself and try and actually achieve something with your life. No, we won't do anything that severe. You play games which incorporate aesthetics and design philosophies from that said genre. And so, we come to Kodalka, a JRPG instilled with horror sensibilities and motifs. Ironically though, it wasn't actually originally planned to be so, but at the same time, it isn't surprising that it did end up being so. Kodalka was the first tentpole game for Saknoth Digital Entertainment, a company founded in 1997. Its founder was Hiroki Kikuta, who previously was most well known for composing music for Secrets and Trials of Mana. However, he became frustrated with being unable to move up from being a composer and so left Square Enix, or Squaresoft at the time, to found his new company, taking some members of Square with him. So, it's not really surprising that this game would have JRPG features, particularly in the area of combat, but Kikuta didn't want it to be this way, and would actually leave the company following the game's release. But that's the basics of the game's history. What about my history with it? For I do have one. Well, not really much of one, to be honest. I've had the game from a very early age, after some family friends gave us a batch of PS1 games at a point, and I played like 20 minutes, but then never really played it again. Mostly because we were more of a PC gaming household, and that's what we were used to gaming on. Which is kind of ironic, since nowadays I associate my PC with work, and so I don't actually like to game on it anymore. But anyway, that's by the by. I have now played Kodalka, so let's talk about it. So, you launch the game, and already I'm excited, because the intro has a Shadow of the Colossus vibe. And then we are subjected to the true horror, the crap PS3 controller, which is now 14 years old and acting up. I then remember that you can use a PS4 controller, but now I need to turn the PS3 controller off. And then the PS4 controller still didn't work, and eventually I realized it's because I pushed the home button hoping to override the PS3 controller, but all that did was turn the PS4 on, and now Bloodborne is running on in the background. Anyway, after actually getting the game going, we get past the CGI cutscene, which does look good, but we'll talk about that later, and we're straight into combat, which is why that is where we will be starting. Combat is kind of a mixture of turn-based tactics and JRPG battling. You are placed on the board and then given the 3 good old tactics game options: perform action, move, or wait. And it does it in the way that I like, in that you can perform the action and then move, rather than action immediately ending the turn. When choosing to move, you are given a movement grid, as is normal for this genre, but there isn't too much to it. You basically cover the board in 2 moves, and are usually better off waiting for the enemy to first move themselves so you can get the first hit in. That being said though, you can arrange your party to protect a certain person, or move more range-oriented characters away from enemies. Also, I'm not 100% sure if this is actually the case, but something I noticed while playing is that ranged attacks actually do more damage closer up. So there is a bit of a risk and reward of keeping them close enough to maximize that damage output, but not also getting completely destroyed themselves. And with boss fights, you are going to need to move around quite a bit to keep the party out of melee range, as they can do some really serious damage. Also, if the enemy moves forward, you can't move past them, so they can cut off your movement range. So if you don't move, you can get yourself trapped in a corner. Onto the actions you can perform, we have attacking, obviously, magic, items, and weapon changing. And this weapon changing is going to be quite key. You have access to melee weapons and ranged weapons, starting with a revolver, but then expanding to rifles, crossbows, and shotguns. And these ranged weapons have limited ammo. So you would think this is where the need to change weapons is coming from. Needing to ration this ammo, and so mostly using magic and melee, and then only bringing out the ranged weapon where necessary. And this is what I first thought as well. But it soon became pretty apparent that they're going to be quite generous with the ammo, to the point where I actually couldn't carry anymore. So then, what is the reason for weapon changing being important? Well, I'll tell you the one that made me do it, and the actual reason. I started to become a bit one track with my weapon when I found the lead pipe. Since Edward looks a bit like James Sunderland in his portrait photo, I decided screw it, we're now playing Silent Hill. Well, that was the plan until... That's right, we have weapon durability. And I wouldn't say I'm a fan. I can think of 2 reasons in favour of it being present, but I can also think of 2 rebuttals to them. The first one being that it's a horror-inspired game, and so you should have limited weaponry, because you generally kind of want to avoid combat, or combat should have a bad payoff. The issue with that is that it's also a JRPG, meaning that you can't really avoid combat. I mean, yes, you can run away, but then you're going to be too underleveled. Also, I did avoid melee combat quite a bit anyway. The enemies do quite a lot of damage, so I was mostly just sticking to magic or ranged attacks. Honestly, magic can see you through quite a big chunk of the game. Now, I would imagine the second argument you could make would be the Breath of the Wild defense, of it encourages you to use different weapons. But the game already does that. The weapons you find often come with elements attached to them, so you will want to switch your weapons up to match up with enemy weaknesses. Also, you have things like spears, for example, which are strong, but you need to be 2 spaces away to use them, so are good for enemies who do range damage, but you won't really use them with enemies who rush in on you. And weapons also have very noticeable effects on the character's stats. A crossbow, for example, can double strength, but then they'll also decrease other stats. So you will want to vary based on whether you need to be faster, take more damage, do more damage, etc. So I don't really think you need the weapons breaking to push you to use different weapons. And another aspect that undermines the durability situation is skill leveling. If you use a particular spell or weapon, the character will level up their affinity with it, which increases its damage and the amount of hits you get with it. So naturally, you would want to attack more to level this up. But how am I supposed to do that when my hammer broke after 4 hits? So not a fan. It might have been better if you could at least know what your durability is, but I'd rather not have it. But let me move on, because this entire argument of mine is actually a bit undermined by something I'll mention later. Having mentioned stats, I want to talk about stats. They're pretty damn important in this game. All of them. Well, maybe not one so much. Strength improves physical damage, vitality increases health, and physical damage resistance. Dexterity increases chance to hit and dodge. Agility improves speed, so the character gets more attacks before others. Intelligence increases magic damage and the amount you heal by. Piety improves magic resistance. Importantly, resistance to your own party's magic as well. So, if you don't balance out by having a high intelligent character, their healing will not be very effective on a high piety character, meaning you'll have to use items instead. Mind improves chances of being successful with magic, including reduced casting time, because spells aren't cast instantly. And luck improves chance of critical hits, and also finding rare item drops after battle. So, you must take note of your stats improvement, and that's up to you how to do it. Every time a character levels up, you get 4 points that you can allocate as you see fit. So you have a bit of freedom in customization, whether you want to try and make a character balanced, or ridiculous at one thing, but then vulnerable to other aspects, which you can then compensate for with the equipment that you can give them. A few more slight negatives. Battles can become tediously long. If you ask me, enemies have a bit too much health. Even standard battles can take longer than a lot of games with similar combat systems. And boss fights even worse so, since they do a lot of damage, which leaves you spending more time healing than actually fighting. The backgrounds for the battles are pretty uninteresting. I appreciate what it's going for, trying to create this vibe of the creatures creeping out of the darkness, but after a while, that does become a bit samey. And lastly, the difficulty curve is pretty wonked. The opening of the game was quite difficult actually, enemies being able to easily one-shot you or end you in a few hits. But then when I got the party of 3, it became quite a bit easier. The enemy still one-shot, but the presence of the other 2 did mitigate that quite a bit. But then it swung back later. I do think there's something in particular responsible for this, but it ties into another aspect, so we'll talk about it then. For now, I will say that I like the idea behind the combat, a lot of cool little tricks and mechanics, but unfortunately there are quite a few niggles which will drag down the experience overextended playtimes. I will say though, after playing Wild Arms recently, with its unique status effects indicated through symbols, which made me need to double check the manual to actually see what they mean, it is nice for a game to just tell me exactly what my ailment is in words. You could actually make a fair few comparisons between Kodalka and Resident Evil. We have a girl character, a big beefy boy, and a third character who you can often rely on to make you roll your eyes, though for different reasons. And we are also stuck in one property where bad things have and continue to go down. But those are all things we'll get onto later. For now, we will talk about similarities in gameplay. Outside of combat, we have much more emulation of the horror staples associated with the PS1. It's not full-blown tank controls, but movement is very similar to what you would find in a Resident Evil or a Silent Hill. Complete with the needing to press X to climb stairs and platforms and open doors. You can also run, and can I just say, after having played a lot of JRPGs recently, the fact that it's triangle to sprint and circle to open the menu is quite annoying. But moving on from the control aspect, the gameplay loop is very survival horror-y. You move throughout the premises and pick up objects while doing so, be they weapons, health items, which includes potions and food, which is an inclusion I always just like, ammo or key items. You will occasionally be blocked from progress by needing to defeat a boss, quite occasionally, or solving puzzles which usually require you to have the necessary key item. Just a quick side note on that, I actually liked the puzzles a lot. I thought they were pretty clever, not too difficult, but at least required you to think a bit. Anyway, there will also be doors which you will need to find keys for to unlock, and then areas of the building that are interconnected with you being able to open up shortcuts to get back to other areas. So, if you enjoy this style of gameplay in other games, you will enjoy it here. And I do enjoy it in other games, and enjoy it here. Though there are two small things which do detract from it. Firstly, it can sometimes be a bit difficult to distinguish things that can be interacted with and doors due to the fixed camera angles and the pre-rendered backgrounds sometimes kind of just meshing things together. It would have been helpful to have the ability to toggle indicators to help with finding interactable items, like in Final Fantasy VII. Secondly, the presence of random encounters can make the need to backtrack, which is inevitable with this gameplay loop, a bit tedious. Sometimes you might just want to quickly cut through a way, but then get bogged down by battles, compared to another game which would allow you to jink past an enemy. But these don't drag from it too much. The gameplay loop is very well reconstituted here, and is actually amplified by the next matter. The vibes of Kodalka are great. The PS1 was perfect for creating a grim, murky, and claustrophobic feel, as was seen in Silent Hill and Metal Gear Solid. Even the areas of Resident Evil, which were brightly lit, used garish and offensive colors which created an unsettling atmosphere. And Kodalka is using that to brilliant effect. It recreates that Victorian era gothic haunted monastery vibe perfectly. I love the pre-rendered backgrounds, and they are used very well to make pretty much every room very unsettling to be in. This is also a point where the random encounters add to the horror feel. The chance of knowing that you can be attacked out of nowhere, and that these enemies have a pretty good chance of doing some decent damage, really ramp up the fear factor. Enhanced even further by the creatures being pretty damn grotesque and gross to look at. But unfortunately, I feel there is an area where it does let itself down, and that is in the aspect of sound design, which is frustrating because it's not that the design is bad, it's just not used enough. The music is great, not surprising for someone who used to work for Square, and the footsteps and occasional background noises are very effective. Again, there just isn't enough of it though. There's only music in the battles, and when exploring, save for footsteps, it's mostly just silent. I just feel like there could have been a bit more ambient music and sound effects to increase that creep factor. For example, there was a point where you walk into a room only lit by moonlight, with a body lying on the floor, an odd noise emanating in the background, and the text just says, "Something doesn't feel right." And this made me feel very concerned. So I feel like we could have just had a bit more effort to create moments like that. Especially given these good moments, where the game does actually make you question whether you want to proceed. I don't know. Onto the CGI, and as I referenced earlier, it is really good. Particularly the faces. Around this time, they were often quite uncanny and awkward, but they're done well here. And I do think the animation is mostly smooth, apart from one point where you can really see the PS1 is struggling for its life. However, despite the goodness, I don't know how necessary it is sometimes. Like, I do just get this feeling on occasions that they just wanted to make a scene CGI to show off. For example, there's this one point where it's like 10 seconds to show a chandelier dropping and play some gunfire noises. I feel like you could have just rendered that in-game. Maybe the game wouldn't have needed to be 4 discs then, especially since they are fully voiced as well. It does just create this kind of stop-start feeling sometimes when you have to have all these loading times in between them. I mean, this is how disc 1 ends.
Kudelka, did you find anything?
No, nothing, but
Speaking of voiced cutscenes, I actually think the voice acting is pretty good, especially given the standards of the time. But ignoring that even, it does a good job of maintaining the seriousness of the situation and doesn't really drag it down or make it seem silly. There is a moment where Kudelka allows herself to be possessed and conveys the thoughts of the spirits, and it was pretty damn uncomfortable. However, what does detract a little bit from these cutscenes is their very abrupt ending. Like sometimes you feel the cutscene is going to continue on, but then just ends. But despite me feeling some things could have been done a bit better just to improve the experience, the aesthetics and atmosphere are pretty damn top notch. And now, for a brief intermission, the Ghost Dancing Trio. I want to quickly talk about this, because when doing research, I saw that one of the common complaints from reviewers at the time was the slow pace. And this is something I really don't understand. I had no real issues with pacing. Okay, I did, but it wasn't due to slowness. Events happen pretty regularly. I would say on average, every 3 rooms or areas features a CGI cutscene, an in-game cutscene, or a boss fight. So as far as I'm concerned, the game subjects you to pretty constant happenings and keeps the pace up. However, in fairness to these journalists, there is some incongruity with the pacing as we continue, but I don't think it's to blame on the pacing in and of itself. I do feel it's a bit too quick though. I mean, I literally finished the first disc in 2 hours, but I will obviously give more detail than that. As I said, on average, there is something every 3 rooms, and I do mean that. Particularly, boss fights are a pretty common occurrence, and as is common for said type of fight, they are noticeably stronger than regular enemies. So if you aren't leveling up regularly, you are going to struggle. But how are you supposed to keep regularly leveled up when you're going to encounter a boss within 4 to 5 areas? So you do kind of have to stop to grind a little bit. Not too much, because you do level up pretty quickly, and leveling up restores health and MP, so it's not such a drag, but it does halt you a little bit. For me, the biggest drag happened leading up to the end of the second disc. The game takes a break from having a lot of cutscenes and slightly less boss fights to have a very Resident Evil part where you have to solve quite a few puzzles, and in so doing, pick up a lot of key items. And then you are hit with the problem that you have inventory space, and communal inventory space at that. Key items, healing items, accessories, weapons all take up the same space. And this brings the weapon durability into strong contention. I was prioritizing using magic and guns in fights, due to the aforementioned restoring of MP from leveling up. And so I left melee weapons to be ready for boss fights and enemies who just genuinely were stronger and so were more likely to get close up. But now these weapons were taking up space that would stop me from being able to continue with story progression. So I was now deliberately getting into battles just to get weapons to break. I realized I could have just thrown them away, but then I'm losing out on gaining the proficiency points. And this is also when I realized, to my frustration, that I guess I just got unlucky with how early my one broke, because they actually are relatively durable. So this did kind of grind things to a bit of a halt. And it's not like I was demanding non-stop action. I was happy to have the puzzling downtime, but this was just added tedium. So maybe this is what happened to those reviewers to believe the pacing was slow, but this is fixed by removing inventory space and having no weapon durability with just maybe less weapons so you don't get overloaded. And again, if you really want to blame pacing, I would say your problem is things actually happening too quickly. But anyway, now that I've proven I'm better than the game's journalists, who are of course woke scum, let's talk about my favorite aspect. Okay, before we get into the weeds with this, just a few quick comments about the narrative aspect. It is your pretty standard horror plot. The creeps and ghouls which we encounter are present because the person who used to live there was killing people to siphon enough energy to resurrect his dead wife. In combination with the fact that the monastery was also a site where a great deal of torture had taken place in the past. So as I say, kind of standard, but presented very well. You don't discover most of this conceit until later on, with the game setting up more than enough intrigue and mystery to keep you interested as you play through, keeping character motivations to be revealed later as well. And it also even leaves some plot aspects a mystery that you will only discover if you do adequate exploration, including actually only getting certain cutscenes if you found certain items. It also does something pretty unique with the final boss fight that I don't think many other games have done. And honestly, any game that has the balls to do this just because you missed an item from halfway into the game deserves some respect. But all of this is particularly held up by the characters involved. Firstly, the occasional NPCs who we encounter do their jobs well, be it the caretakers first cutting malicious figures before adding to the feeling of paranoia and spiraling horror later, or Charlotte, who runs alongside with the plot and assists with Kodalka's characterization, but also just gives some life to the ghosts and creatures of the monastery. Or Roger Bacon, the undead priest who has been around for hundreds of years, who adds to the insanity of the situation, being this shambling, crazy figure running around the horror while just being jubilant almost. Though, he does get a bit annoying when he goes on for too long. But obviously, most focal are our main characters. Number 1, our eponymous character, Kodalka. She is a spirit medium, having the ability to commune with the dead, and has arrived at the monastery for an initially undisclosed reason. She comes across as pretty cold and abrupt at first. Our opening encounter with her sees her speaking very matter-of-factly and kind of callously over a wounded and closing in on death Edward. But then we're given a slight hint into another part of her character as she promptly goes on to heal him. And then as we continue, we get to see more insights into an empathetic and compassionate person just jaded with a hardened shell, eventually progressing into seeing a character with a relatable cynicism and also a lot of vulnerability, reaching its climax at the end of the third disc in a maybe slightly clunky over-expository way if you really want to be the lord of literature about it, but it has been completely earned at this point. In a bit of a contrast, we have Edward, who honestly, I'm not exactly sure what he does, like what's his actual profession. But anyway, his character is a bit of a contrast to Kodalka. He at first comes across as a bit naive, but ultimately good-hearted, as he gets fooled into being poisoned by the caretakers. But as we move along, we get to see a bit more of an increasing cynicism, and as a result, a stoicism to the situation he has been placed in.
These treasures must have been taken from them, soaked with curses and hatred. You'll be cursed if you worship those things.
I am a busy man that does not have patience to teach you the importance of faith. But I will tell you why we have found these treasures. It could only have come from the guidance of God. God sees all, he knows all. Got it?
Preach to the converted.
What about you, Edward? You seem a little more educated than she.
I don't really care.
And just like with Kodalka, we have a culmination of another understandable and likable character who shows more complexity as we progress through the plot. Lastly, James the Priest, who starts off being very unlikable. Honestly, I still wasn't completely crazy about him by the end, but he does undergo good character development. He initially is pretty damn bigoted and hateful, showing no concern for people being punished if he deems them to be immoral. Meanwhile, refusing to believe that people who seem to be of good position could do something wrong. But it is revealed that his being a priest in the first place is due to him having lost the person he loved to someone else. So his entry in the priesthood is a source of bitterness and uses it as a shield to block out a past life. Interesting and compelling characters in their own right, but what's even more important is how they engage with each other. And those character dynamics are good. These initial personality traits contrast well with each other and create some good early conflict. For example, Koudelka is a Reddit atheist, and so clashes with James's overt piety, which is a bit unfair since it's actually quite helpful in combat. And in a similar way, Edward does not appreciate his dismissiveness of the impoverished.
Yeah. Good assessment for a thief.
You're crazy if you believe this scoundrel. This killer's obviously executed hundreds of people. He needs to be turned into the police and judged in a proper forum.
We're crazy. Why? Just because he's an immigrant? Or is it because he's one of the unsaved? That's bull and you know it, you pig-headed old bigot.
What I'm trying to say is
this guy. Thieves can be exceedingly honest, you know? Still, he did try to kill us.
Of course, following this, we will get our inevitable getting along and forming bonds that is standard of storytelling, but it's more done in a let's just work together to survive this kind of way, rather than we've learned so much together kind of way. There is actually a point where there's an attempt to be made at bonding on a more personal level, but this leads to assumptions that actually create more friction and conflict. I mean, as the party head to the area of the final confrontation, they each try and get the other two to piss off, giving the justification they want to do it alone. And can I just say, I was playing this alongside Wild Arms 2, and with it stopping every couple of hours for the party to talk about being stronger together through the power of friendship, this was quite refreshing. So, we have a plot which is well structured and does a good job of creating intrigue, which along with the use of contained and claustrophobic locations allows for the basis of an emphasis on characterization and interactions. And this is used to create great characters with great dynamics. So, after 20 years, I have finally finished Koudelka. And was the wait worth it? I would say so. I'm not gonna say that this is a complete utter gaming classic, which should be held up with the stalwarts of history. There are definitely flaws. As I said, the combat specifically has too many niggles which drag on it after extended playing. But the exploration gameplay is really good, the atmosphere is top notch, the plot compelling, and the characters great. What we have is a game that is mostly committed to what it wants to do and executes it. And as I discussed before, the industry could really do with more of that. But it's not just about it being tight and focused. It's about being a game that does something differently. With Resident Evil solidifying the survival horror genre as the means by which to do horror games, the choice to do a horror RPG was something unique, a feature of the experimental age that came with this era. Imagine going to Microsoft today and showing them a game like Kodalka. They wouldn't even wait for the game to release before closing down the studio. Sony would ask you why the game is only 12 hours long and tell you need to add at least 5 more in order to make it more cinematic. Nintendo would actually show this to Nintendo. Maybe it will get them to remember they have Eternal Darkness and we can finally get a port. But in all earnestness, while we do have indie games to give us different gaming experiences, it would be nice to see the companies that have the financial means to take a risk actually do something like that. Psychonauts' creation was funded by SNK, a company which was successful and known for arcade fighters. I'm not really one who's big on the ideas of remakes or remasters. I feel that games as far back as the SNES even, but particularly from the PS1 era, hold up more than well enough that you can play them as is just by porting them. And you won't have true games preservation unless you keep those original works. But honestly, I actually wouldn't mind seeing a remake here. We already have the plot and characters. The aesthetic is set and can even be further improved on with the tools we have today. I mean, there's some really creepy stuff here that could be made really horrifying with today's graphics and animation. And despite my complaints, the combat has some good ideas that could be built off of. But the original is great in its own right, and you should play it if you can.